All right. Well, welcome back. Let me thank everybody in the room and online who has stuck around, which is a fantastic feat of endurance already. We have another great panel to go, and then some networking at the end of today. I'm really excited to chair this panel with Neil and Rachel and David and Josh on the topic of accelerating clean technology innovation and U.S. competitiveness, or as I like to call it, the HOPE panel. It's been a lot of gloom and doom. We ended with Secretary Moniz's hopeful perspective, and so we're going to, I hope, continue that with this panel. And then we'll let the last panel be back down in the gloom and doom zone. So before I turn it over to the panelists, I'm going to just make a few framing remarks. And I wanted to just set this in the context, this topic in the context of climate realism. So to me, realism is about countries following their self-interest. So I'm a political scientist. That's where I get my definition of it. And it's very rare, perhaps unknown, for countries to act altruistically. So if we're going to address clean energy and climate globally, we're going to need countries to act in their self-interest. And I think that's a big part of the explanation for why progress is limited. And we heard something about that already today. But innovation is exciting because it's a way of creating interest, right? If you're a country, you have certain mineral resources, you may have renewable resources, you have sun, you have wind, or you don't. But innovation is a way to create a resource and then act on that as an interest internationally. And you don't have to look any further than China to see how this can happen. So China has accelerated its investments in solar, in lithium-ion batteries, in electric vehicles, what President Xi calls the new three export industries, and they are now exporting like crazy. That didn't exist 25 years ago, right? China still has the same renewable resources it had then, still has the same mineral resources it had then, but it has this new industry that it's pursuing. The question for the panel, at least in part, is what's the U.S. going to do? So Secretary Moniz said, unless we do something, it's not going to change. We do have enormous potential here. The United States has the most robust innovation ecosystem in the world, in my view. But we have to mobilize that and focus it. It's partly about money. For sure, we have to make investments. But we also have to make smart investments. We have to have a strategy. At least that's my perspective, and we'll see what the panelists think. And I also think we need to change our institutions to some degree. And there's been some experimentation with that in recent years. Some of that is really on the table right now as the U.S. debates its next move in energy policy. But that also pertains to our foreign engagements as well. We're going to need some combination of competition on the one hand and collaboration, both with our allies and our adversaries, maybe not in exactly the same mix with allies and adversaries. But we need investment, we need reform, and we need institution building. At least that's my idea. So I'll let the panelists take those themes up, but let me introduce them first. So to my immediate right, Neil Chatterjee, currently the Chief Government Affairs Officer at Palmetto, but formerly the Chair of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So all regulatory questions will be directed at Neil. Next to him is Rachel Pritzker. Rachel is the president and founder of the Pritzker Innovation Fund. If you haven't ever heard of the Eco-Monetist Manifesto, it's kind of a pillar of climate realism before it was climate realism, but she has been a driving force in this community and this way of thinking for a long time. Next to Rachel is David Livingston. Glad to have at least one other David on the panel. I felt sorry for that earlier panel. I only had one David. This panel has two. The next one will have two. So you get your full share of Davids here. So this particular David, Chief Strategy Officer at Galvanize Climate Solutions. Before that, worked for the Special Envoy for Climate with Varun in the Biden administration. And in the Obama administration, served in the U.S. Trade Representative's office. And then furthest to my right, although kind of metaphorically not in the right position, Josh Freed, Senior Vice President for Climate and Energy at Third Way, a longtime leader in linking national responses to the climate challenge to innovation and competitiveness. So he's an ideal person to have. And nobody garners more respect in the community, I think, than Josh, other than the other members of the panel. So I'm going to start with Rachel. So Rachel, I wonder if you could just open us up with some initial thoughts from your perspective as a philanthropist. Where are we at? So this is, in a sense, the mitigation pillar of our three-part initiative. where are we at in the mitigation challenge? And if we think about China and the U.S., as examples of countries that are pursuing mitigation, how do we build coalitions that can last and pursue what is a challenging agenda?
How are we doing? Yeah, I mean, that's a big question. But first I want to start by just saying I appreciate this climate realism frame quite a lot. I've long felt that the U.S. really hasn't had a terribly consistent, let alone big enough strategy to match the scale of this challenge, and certainly hasn't had the politics to get us there. So, yeah, I think this is an important conversation to be kicking off. I also, I think green groups and environmental philanthropy haven't been terribly helpful in this, making sure we're in a realistic frame also. So I'm hopeful that we can encourage them on that score. And finally, I think the climate realism frame is really important because the geopolitics of, as it relates to this climate transition is a real challenge, and I think it needs to be taken more seriously in weighing sort of these trade-offs. So what's a realistic strategy? I guess I would echo Moniz and say that any progress is going to be constrained by economic realities. And so, this, I don't know if you have all heard of the Roger Pielke Jr.'s iron law of climate policy, which is that when policies on emissions reductions come in conflict with policies on economic growth will always win. And I haven't seen an example of it being disproven, so I think it's worth taking quite seriously. But then the way you get out of that is, again, as Moniz said, technological innovation. You have to make the clean energy cheaper, which is something that we said in 2015 in the Eco-Modernist Manifesto, and certainly we're not the only ones. But so I think focusing on innovation is key. But I also fund in both climate and democracy. And I am deeply concerned about the fact that while autocracies like China are essentially doing it all, they're investing in dirty energy, they're investing in clean energy, they're exporting and capturing markets, we in the developed nations are often constraining ourselves in a variety of ways, including in terms of which energy options we're willing to invest in, and we're constraining others sometimes as well. And the other way that I think we are not taking these sort of conflicts between democracy and climate mitigation seriously is at home in our own democracies. And this is in part because, as we've seen, driving up the costs of energy or making our energy supply less reliable can have this effect of lowering support, or I should say raising support for illiberal parties, illiberal policies, and it is a concern that we've seen within democratic nations. So a realistic policy, I guess, is we have to acknowledge the daunting math. We're basically having to remake not just our economy, but like all the core systems of modernity, so we should be a little humble about that. We should also see clearly that the U.S.'s, I think, most important role in achieving good climate outcomes is probably not just in lowering our own emissions, but in exporting better, cheaper, clean technologies. And finally, that we take into consideration the economic, political, geopolitical priorities and balance them with the environmental priorities. So I would leave it there.
Thanks very much. Neil, I saw you nodding your head a little bit on economic growth versus environmental priorities. Maybe you could pick up with that theme?
Yeah, look, I loved everything Rachel just laid out. I thought it was a very straightforward, kind of candid assessment of what we face. And she laid out some pretty tough points about what happens when decarbonization goals and economic priorities, kind of collide. This is not the doom and gloom panel. This is the optimistic panel. So I'm going to start with a degree of optimism. Look, I actually feel pretty good about the direction that we are going to go, because I think economic and national security realities are going to drive decisions that will ultimately have a positive impact on climate policy. What do I mean by that? So right now, we're 2 months into a new administration, which is still very much in the ethos of the first administration and the campaign of drill, baby, drill, and heavy emphasis on fossil fuels and kind of discrediting clean energy resources as the Green New Scam and other kinds of, kind of rhetorical things that drive headlines. But when you actually take a step back and look at what President Trump has said about energy policy, he essentially made 2 commitments to the American people. One was to win the AI race against China for national security purposes, with an understanding that will require a tremendous amount of electricity. And 2 was to significantly bring down the cost of electricity for consumers. Well, in order to achieve those 2 objectives, the collision of kind of economic policy with energy reality, I actually think it's going to upend the politics that have kind of interfered with energy policy for the past 2 decades. We've gotten kind of entrenched in this antiquated notion that if you're for fossil fuels, you're of the political right, and if you're for clean energy and climate solutions, you're of the political left. And I think both sides are going to have to reevaluate the positioning going forward. I think on the political left, there has to be a recognition that we cannot possibly meet the coming surge in demand for energy. And it's not just being driven by data centers necessary to support AI. It's being driven by vehicle electrification, building electrification, quantum computing, cloud computing, streaming services, Bitcoin and crypto mining, a reshoring of manufacturing, semiconductor manufacturing. All of these things are incredibly energy intense endeavors. And the reason that we've sort of been locked into this antiquated notion the last 2 decades is because we've been the beneficiaries of relatively flat demand. That era is over. We are now entering an era in which demand is going to surge. And I think the left needs to recognize we cannot possibly meet this coming surge in demand without fossil fuels, at least in the short term. And I think the right needs to recognize we cannot possibly meet this coming surge in demand and win the AI race against China for national security purposes with fossil fuels alone. We're going to need every available electron. And that means solar, that means storage, that means wind, that means geothermal, that means hydrogen, that means nuclear. You know what? It also means negawatts. It means demand response, energy efficiency, VPPs, distributed energy resources. This is the path forward. And I think that as people get seated in this new administration and start to actually look at their portfolios and what their mandate is and what their mission is, I actually am genuinely optimistic that the economic and national security realities are going to have a positive impact on climate policy. Now, again, this is all about climate realism. Is the administration going to say climate change or decarbonization? They absolutely will not. But that's okay if the result of the policies that they have to pursue in order to win the AI race have a positive impact on decarbonization and the climate. I'm fine with that if they don't want to call it decarbonization or climate. I think these interests, as Rachel really eloquently laid out, are intertwined, and that is why I'm not on the doom and gloom panel. I feel pretty optimistic that we're going to nail this.
Thanks, Josh. Thanks, Neil. Josh, so beyond left and right, in the long run, is there a durable consensus to be had on innovation in energy?
So I'm going to try to add a little friction to the panel, even though I think across all of us right now, there's a lot of agreement amongst us on what this looks like. we focus a lot on separating the signal from the noise in policy. And I think Varun has laid out an excellent way to do that in terms of how do you formulate what climate realism looks like. And we saw that in a lot of ways in a continuum between the actions of the first Trump administration and the Biden administration. So fossil fuel production continued to grow under both. Record production under President Biden towards the end of his term. You saw innovation investments continue to grow, led by a Republican Congress, but signed into law by President Trump throughout his term. You can pick a lot of innovation and energy policies where there was building across both in terms of what was actually done, enabling legislation, the Energy Act of 2020, which really set up investments in a lot of the programs that became part of the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. So you have an interesting drive in the right direction that ended up being really the industrial policy that emerged in the latter half of the Biden administration that included some protectionism, a true all of the above energy agenda that included nuclear, hydro, fossil fuels, and on and on. So there was a consensus. There wasn't a consensus and still isn't amongst a lot of the groups on both the left and the right in terms of both how they talk about it and also the politics that they think can win either for themselves, even though they'd never admit that, or win in terms of their coalitional politics and getting more of the people they want into office. The key thing for all of this that we believe motivated what policy should be in the United States, and particularly what the private businesses and the capital who were investing it was access to global markets. That the global market for clean energy is going to be in the trillions and trillions of dollars. I mean, that's what's motivating a lot of what China is doing to invest in both clean tech as well as continue to consume and use coal and fossil fuels. It's what's driving so much of the demand in all of the different technologies we're seeing, in the fact that you're having now an enormous boom, not just in the production of electric vehicles in China, but also the different types. They have a new model of electric vehicle rolled out in China every 2 days. The thing that, to add the friction to this, the real challenge we have now is the policies that the second Trump administration are rolling out is not consistent with the first Trump administration. Whether it's DOGE is now within the Department of Energy, and we're likely to see dramatic cuts into a lot of programs that had carried through some of the goals that they had set out themselves in the first administration. And the tariff policies, which are roiling our markets and markets around the world in real time. It may have changed in the last half an hour, in the last 15 minutes since we started, really does raise concerns about what are American companies and American investors going to do? What kind of access will they have to other markets? And whether they'll be able to continue to build the projects, invest in the R&D, and have the kind of access that they need to continue to move forward with innovation and competitiveness.
David, maybe you can pick up on the theme of global markets, the U.S.'s position relative to its allies and its adversaries in clean tech. What does that look like from your perspective now that you're outside of government? I don't know if you're in the investment directly, but kind of being part of that world.
Well, thank you, David. And yeah, I mean, I share your concern about Davidflation and think we need to get it.
David inflation, yeah, too many.
First, and let me also congratulate CFR for the launch of the Climate Realism Project. Let me congratulate Varun on a really excellent paper and a thoughtful set of other discussions this morning. A lot has already been said, but not everyone has said it. So let me have a go at it. No, I would reiterate. I would iterate on everything that's been said. I really love the way that everyone up here on the panel has laid it out, and I would just reiterate. I think we need to make an explicit effort to expand the landing zone where we can meet people who come at this issue with different priorities and different perspectives in the middle, without having to welcome them as saying, thanks for coming to my side, thanks for seeing the light. Instead, you should meet them where they are and say, your priorities are as legitimate as mine, and we welcome meeting in this common space, right? And that means that we're not always gonna need to even have the word climate in it. I mean, look, I think that I believe that over the long to medium term, we'll see the Republican Party, this administration, continue to try and find its own voice and its own approach on climate change. I think it is a party that believes that climate is an issue in large part and is trying to find its own approach and again, its own voice on the issue. And I think that's actually a very important process for it to go through. At the same time, you see a Democratic Party on the other side that's now, in the wake of this last election, trying to find its own voice and articulating that a future that is, to borrow the word of the moment, an abundant future. A future that can be more affordable, offer more options, offer freedom rather than a diminishment of choice, right? Offer abundance rather than scarcity by scaling up every possible viable electron, every possible viable molecule, and as quickly as possible making sure that we're getting those electrons and molecules to be as clean as possible as well. I am optimistic now sitting in the private sector because I think that so much of the innovation engine and the deployment engine that is needed to deliver that abundance agenda sits right here in the United States. So, whether we're talking about the leading enhanced geothermal company, Fervo, that has a largely American supply chain, and by the way, with smart bipartisan policy by, let's say, bringing geothermal under the 45X tax credit for, inputs into the geothermal supply chain, we can make sure that this is an almost exclusively US-made, baseload, clean, secure, affordable energy solution, where we are, when we are drilling, right, we're drilling for clean electrons in addition to traditional hydrocarbon molecules. That revolution, that clean energy, that clean geothermal revolution is at our fingertips to be unleashed. So much nuclear expertise and innovation still sits within the United States. When we think about like QuantumScape, the leading solid-state battery company that's on the verge of disrupting the next generation of energy storage technology, that is a US company. So we think about the companies that are also working to, I love that Neil mentioned that negawatts are the cheapest megawatt out there. So much of this is not just about how do we commercialize the next technology that's gonna help in hard to abate sectors. There is also so much low-hanging fruit that exists right in front of corporates that just has to be brought to their attention in terms of easy, no-regret decisions that are value accretive to the corporate, to the employees, and to ultimately shareholder value in that company. And there are companies out there like Watershed, for example, that are helping companies not just to track, report their emissions for compliance purposes, but also actually helping to unearth solutions that pay for themselves in year one that are helping them to run leaner, meaner businesses that capture greater market share. So, the message that I would put out there is just that from a private sector perspective, there is actually still so much energy, so much excitement in the next stage of the energy transition going forward. And we need to detach this energy transition from culture wars and the ideological battles that take place here in this city, unleash the best of American ingenuity, American industrial capacity and industrial capability, and recognize that just as the Biden administration was building on some positive strains of what started in the Trump administration, that itself was probably building on some things in the Obama administration, the Trump administration too has an opportunity to not rip up things and start from scratch, but take the progress we made on nuclear in the last administration, took the progress we made on geothermal in the last administration, took the progress we made on carbon capture in the last administration, take that baton and run with it. And we need to be ready, regardless of our ideological stripe, to celebrate that when it happens. So I think, if we can all turn down the temperature and just focus a little bit on the future we need to create, we'll be in good place.
All right, now you guys are way too happy for me. Too much happy talk. So let me be the voice of maybe a little darkness here and push back. And we're going to open it up to questions in a few minutes, but I want to get one more round here briefly. So we know that attention is limited. We know that resources are limited. We know that patience is limited. I think the last few years have proved, maybe the last few minutes have proven that. So can the United States afford to try to be a global leader in everything? I think 20 years ago that was standard if you read National Academies or Rising Above the Gathering Storm report, they're like global leadership across the board. Is that still a realistic objective for the United States? Or do we have to choose? And then we could get to the harder questions about how we choose and what we choose. But let's just ask the question, do we have to choose? Are there some things we say, China's too far ahead, or whoever, another country is too far ahead? Let's focus our bets on us, not all of the above, half of the above or something. Josh, you want to?
Yeah, so 3 years ago, in part inspired by some suggestions of Varun and David, Third Way worked with Boston Consulting Group and Breakthrough Energy to commission a report to ask that exact question. And the great news is across 10 different clean energy sectors, they identified a huge number of subsectors and value chains for nuclear, for geothermal, for long duration storage, and on, where the United States can be competitive. And they looked at it in the context of what has China already done, where are they, and where are other countries? And the important thing is to really understand it's not just a specific technology, but it is the subsectors within that technology that we need to really look at and decide not only can we compete, but also even if we're behind, is there a national security imperative for us to own part of that supply chain? And so part of the goal of industrial strategy, which both administrations, Biden and Trump, have employed, is that it really does help tease both of those questions out. Is there subsectors of a specific technology where the U.S. has competitive advantage or could have that? And whether we do or not, is there a national security imperative to lean into? And there's a real roadmap. We have both of those reports on our website. They spell out a lot of it. Others have been doing excellent work in this as well.
Can I jump on that though? Because I actually want to say, this is an issue area where I completely agree with the great work that was done by you in coordination with us when we were in government. But my thinking has even personally evolved on this a little bit, as I think we should all make an effort to try and do more of, keep an open mind and evolve our thinking as the times change. If anything, the speed and scale at which what is clearly the speed and scale of AI infrastructure deployment and the demand pull, the energy demand pull, as Neil was referencing, right? That's taken us out of decades of stagnant electricity growth into a period of sustained structural secular demand tailwinds in the electricity sector. I think also underscore that by picking out sectors in which we can be particularly competitive, I think there's a danger in juxtaposing those against general support for getting more cheap, clean, fast electrons on the grid. And I think now more than ever, and even more so than 3 or 4 years ago, there is a premium on getting cheap, fast, clean, secure electrons onto the grid. And so none of this, personally, I think should be construed as in opposition to just baseline investment and production tax credits that are not just about the energy sector. The thing that we have to recognize now is that if AI sovereignty or AI dominance or whatever you want to call it is a national security imperative for the United States, and if that becomes essentially a derivative function of access to cheap, reliable, clean, affordable power, everything that we do in the energy sector to bring those cheap electrons on faster is also essentially a stimulus to a broader set of sectors across the economy. And so we cannot think about it only in the silo of, oh, this is just one sectoral support, platform. It's like, I see my friend Dan Poneman here in the front, right? He's doing incredible things with Centrus Energy to make sure that we're not just leaders in the current and next generation of nuclear technology, but also to make sure that we've got American leadership in the nuclear fuel cycle and the nuclear supply chain, right? In a way, cheap electrons, cheap clean electrons are the fuel cycle for AI sovereignty and AI dominance and AI leadership. So we need to make sure that we're investing in that supply chain as well, even if we are talking about deploying more mature technologies in which the United States may not have as much of a natural or defensible comparative advantage. That is still an underlying important, I think, foundation of what we do, even as we lean in even more to the areas of growing, next generation technologies where we can have true, capture of market share and true defensible leadership over time.
Just to follow up on both of your excellent comments, I think, and also because obviously I have been abundance pilled also, One way of saying what I think we need to do if we want to build a lot and eventually compete in the rest of the world is, I think on the left side of our politics, we need to get over our sort of process fetish, which is standing in the way of actually building a lot of things. And on the right side of our politics, we have to get over our distrust of scientific expertise and a lot of scientific institutions if we want to actually innovate in a bunch of areas, because we need, obviously, to both innovate and build. But to throw a little cold water on how we're doing in some of the sectors that I do think we still could be competitive on, I recently saw the fact that in the last 5 years, the only nuclear power plants that have begun construction were either Russian or Chinese designs. We are basically AWOL globally and at home on competing in that sector that, you know, we actually have a lot of great innovative startups, and obviously it's something that we originally created as a sector. So that is something we should be fighting for. And one of the things we need to do to compete is figure out what would be a more efficient, goal-oriented way of doing development finance. I know this is a strange time to say that when a bunch of our tools are coming under assault, but to be honest, we needed to kind of rethink. We have these capacities sprinkled all throughout the government. It's not obvious how they're being held accountable. We could come up with something more efficient and more targeted. And so here's my chance to give a plug to the Energy for Growth Hub, which has recently proposed something called Energy Security Compacts that I think could be a useful framework whenever, hopefully, we get to rebuild some of this capacity. And I'll leave it there.
I know you're trying to inject doom and gloom into this panel.
I'm doing my
I'm
best.
sorry.
I'm so sorry.
I'm gonna keep it on the positive. Look, when I first took my seat at a domestic energy market regulator, I didn't think I would have much exposure in the international arena. And I was pleasantly surprised to find that our allies around the world wanted to meet with me not to discuss liquefied natural gas exports or other trading of commodities. They look at the US and they look at our grid in particular with envy. I know it's very easy. We are all hyper self-critical here in America, and we are constantly in a doom and gloom perspective about the state of our policy and our politics. The rest of the world wants to learn from us. And I spent my tenure as chairman of FERC traveling the world, meeting with our allies and educating them on what has worked and what hasn't worked for us in our experiment with competitive wholesale power markets, in our ability to maintain a reliable and affordable grid while squeezing carbon out of the US power sector. So there was a good story to be told here. The doom and gloom part is, like, this stuff is hard. If it were easy, I'd have done it when I was chair of FERC and we wouldn't even be here today. But it's hard. Building things in this country is very challenging. And I was actually screaming this from the rooftops during my waning days at the commission, that we have this irony that the historical opponents of building energy infrastructure, because it was largely fossil infrastructure, have now become the proponents of building transmission lines to get clean energy onto the grid. The problem is you can't tie up the approval and certification process for natural gas pipelines under the NGA on one side and not expect those same hurdles to appear under the Federal Power Act side when it comes to building transmission. Because the reality is that NIMBYism, not in my backyardism, is not political, it's not ideological. Americans don't want energy infrastructure coming through their backyards, whether it's a transmission line to deliver clean energy or a pipeline to deliver gas. It's too hard to build things in this country. So I think this is the primary area that we need to tackle if we're going to compete and be leaders. And we have to be. It's not an option, to your question. We have to continue to be leaders in this space and in driving decarbonization. But there's some tough calls that have to be made, and someone just has to make them. So when it comes to building transmission lines, the easiest thing to do would be to use existing right-of-ways, where we've already got existing infrastructure, build new transmission along that right-of-way. here's the challenge. If you're in a community that was subject to a previous round of infrastructure build out, you're saying, why are you coming through my backyard again? Now, as an academic exercise, I think I could make a credible case that in this instance, we'll be building a transmission line that will displace a more polluting source of generation, and over the course of time, your air and your water will get cleaner. So it's in your interest to have this transmission line come through your community. As an academic exercise, maybe that works, but as a real world exercise, that's a really hard sell to tell this community, why are our neighbors preserved again? Because they can lawyer up, because they can fight this. Why do you have to come through our community again? That's a tough moral call. I have had state commissioners, my former state colleagues, come up to me and say, Neil, we would love for FERC to roll us, because that's the only way we'll get this project built in our community. And I'm sitting here like, I like to go on vacation. Like, I might want to come to your community. Like, why do I have to be the bad guy to do this? Like, you make the tough calls. Nobody wants to make those tough calls. There are other issues that are just complex here that rise above politics. They're just tricky, thorny issues. The biggest one to me is around cost allocation. So you have state A that has a ton of renewable capacity. You have state C that has huge demand for energy. What happens to ratepayers in state B? Now, again, as an academic exercise, I think I could make a very clear case that ratepayers in state B will receive a genuine benefit in the form of alleviated transmission congestion, which is very real. Transmission congestion is one of the biggest problems that we have on our grid today. So as an academic exercise, I'm like, yeah, state B, you're kind of benefiting from this. But as a real life exercise, going to ratepayers in state B and saying you're benefiting from neither the generation nor the consumption of the power, we're going to build a transmission line through your backyard that you don't want, and we're going to make you pay for it, for part of it, that's a really, really hard sell. So these are tough and challenging questions. But at the end of the day, to bring it back to the optimistic, the reason I am in the positive mood that I am is these are all math problems. And you know who can solve math problems? Engineers. And so to me, people ask me all the time, Neil, you paint this picture of the challenges we have in our energy and climate landscape, like this seems untenable, how do we solve this? And I don't say this to be flippant or funny, like I mean it. We need to make energy policy boring again. Bad for seminars and webinars like this, but good for America. Because when energy policy is boring, and you allow the nerds to construct it, nerds are really good at this, and they can do it without any of the kind of ancillary distractions. What has unfortunately happened the last couple of decades is everyone from politicians to celebrities to CEOs to entrepreneurs have gotten interested in energy and energy policy, and we are therefore now making decisions about complex things like resource adequacy that used to be left to engineers. I want to re-empower the engineers. I don't want politicians or celebrities making calls about resource adequacy. I want the engineers and the economists to sort it out, re-empower the nerds, and we solve this whole thing.
All right, so before we get
Can
we get boring
I just
again.
add one second to that?
1 second.
Because I think actually I have a call that would follow your point to climate philanthropy and NGOs, which is to please stop raising awareness. I'm not sure this is helping. I don't think all the climate messaging actually is doing what you think it's doing. I think it could, in fact, be further polarizing the issue entirely because it's not popular. Things we're selling to the public right now labeled climate, it's not their top priority. I'm not sure it's ever going to be their top priority because what I continue to remind myself and my philanthropic partners, and frankly, I'm sure all of us who really care about climate would be in this bucket, we are the weird ones. The voters are not the same as we are. They don't care as much about climate.
Thank you. So before we get too boring, I would invite your questions on the theme of clean tech, innovation, and competitiveness. We can take questions from online. We'll start here in the room, and I just remind you that it's on the record. And we have one very persistent questioner right there.
Hi, my name is Courtney Winterhill, Department of State. First of all, as a trained engineer, really appreciate that call to empower the nerds. So I had the privilege to go on a climate and energy themed term member trip through CFR a couple weeks ago, and we heard a member of the private sector say that in order to meet, the climate pressures, but also energy demand, that we need kind of a Manhattan Project for energy in the United States. I'm curious about your thoughts on that, and then any thoughts on what such a project would look like.
Can I jump in there?
I'm going to take that one first.
You go
So,
first. And I'll go
yeah,
second.
so as a somewhat historian, not an engineer, but sometime historian, I don't think the metaphor is very good. The Manhattan Project was to meet a very specific challenge in a very specific time frame under wartime mobilization conditions. Now, that doesn't mean we should not be concerned and we should be building big stuff. And the Manhattan Project is still out there. We don't have anybody from DOE here, but about 20% of their budget is still cleaning up that mess that was left behind. So hopefully we could do big stuff, but not as hastily. And I just don't think the will is there. Neil?
I actually don't even think it's necessary. So in my view, right now, we have to look at time to market, right? We have this huge surge in demand that is coming. And my former colleagues at FERC are kind of wrestling with this because they're left with a no-win situation. People are pursuing data center co-location deals. I'm not going to bore you with all the details. It goes completely contrary to my last response. But generally, what we're talking about here is going to existing sources of generation, like nuclear generators, and plugging a data center into that existing generator. The reason being you can get immediate power and it's carbon-free generation. The problem with that is we have limited capacity in this country, and by taking limited capacity at a time when prices are already high behind the meter, you're therefore spreading out even higher costs amongst fewer ratepayers, and that causes consternation. And then theoretically, if we allocated all of these megawatts to data centers, you might have a challenge to resource adequacy. So the reality is we need more supply. I don't think we need a Manhattan Project to drive that growth in supply. It's there. Look, new gas, with our shortage of gas turbines, we're probably looking 2029, 2030 at the earliest before we can get new gas online, while former Secretary Poneman and others are working in the nuclear space. I, for one, think the timeline for advanced new nuclear coming online is even longer than that. The quickest thing we can do is solar plus storage with gas peakers to balance the grid, and we can do that in the next 12 months. That's not going to require some massive wholesale change in policy. It's there. Our interconnection queues are backed up right now throughout the wholesale markets in the country. There is tons of clean, high capacity factor generation ready to be deployed that just can't get plugged in because of regulatory bottlenecks. That's a solvable math problem. So I actually think we can get there without having to kind of completely revamp our energy economy.
Question in the front here.
Thank you all very much. Sherry Goodman, great panel. So assume Secretary of Energy Chris Wright comes to you and he says, okay, energy dominance. I get that we're dominant in all the conventional incumbent fuels. And China is beating us in solar and EVs and in lithium-ion batteries. But we've got to win the next generation of clean energy in nuclear and next-gen batteries, solid state and geothermal, and we've got to solve our transmission problems. What three things are you going to tell them to do?
Yeah, so, I mean, I'll start particularly with the nuclear side.
So it's spoken like a true public policy professor. This is like the classic public policy professor question. Three things.
Yeah, for fission and fusion, we need to ensure there's regulatory certainty. So if there is a company that applies to the NRC, they need to know that the timeline will be met by the NRC to evaluate it, and that they will also have a transparent way that the project gets licensed. So that's one. Financing is the second. We need to help support these companies, especially advanced nuclear, so that they can have an order book of the 10 to 12 of these novel technologies so they can get to the other side of the innovation cycle. And they're you can get private capital to really invest in the entire company. Supply chains are built up and everything else there. And Dan's favorite is fuel. The United States outsourced fuel manufacturing to Russia for decades. We've all known that it was an awful decision and an awful policy. We're still not to the point where we're making either enough sufficient fuel for the existing reactors or the HALEU fuel that advanced reactors are going to need. We need to accelerate that. The Department of Energy has been way too slow, for example, for developing that policy. Yes, so so I'm preaching to the choir about that.
He said that, I just don't see it happening in
Yeah.
that administration, and I'm not sure I see
No.
it happening yet this administration.
And we need to do it, so it's unfortunately, it's another example of a bipartisan failure.
Yeah.
And it's a place where this isn't about partisan politics, it's about the sort of stasis of the bureaucracy that's causing these problems, regardless of who's in power.
All right, I had one in the back there. Yep.
Hi, good afternoon. Rob Edwards, Jr. with Hamilton Clark Sustainable Capital and a two-time senior appointee at the DOE. Building on Rachel's comments about nuclear, as well as your comments about nuclear, when Dan Poneman and I were at the DOE under President Obama, we did the Plant Vogtle power plant conditional commitment. It started out as a $2 billion conditional commitment, and it grew to $12 billion. But Units 3 and 4 at Plant Vogtle were built, which were the most recent examples of AP1000s being built in the United States. So, Rachel, I say to you and everybody on this panel, can we do that again under this LPO to perhaps build a new plant at Calvert Cliffs?
I have no idea. I would love to see that happen. I have no idea. I mean,
I believe we can do it. I do have an idea. Yes, the answer is yes.
okay. I'll take your word for it, but I mean, I'm not holding my breath, but I hope you're right.
Let me just build on that, if I could, to talk about the tools involved, right? So you're talking about the Loan Program Office. I'm not sure everybody listening is familiar with that office. And that's an office that helps the market, private investors be confident, but isn't providing money directly. Then we have other tools that were developed more recently, the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations is the one I'm thinking of specifically, where the public and private sector both put money into projects, which are meant to make follow-on investors feel more confident. So they're investing in experimental nuclear plants, but hopefully, if that one is proven, then the next one can be 100%. And I think those kinds of tools really are on the chopping block right now.
Yeah, that's what I worry about.
I think we need to rename Dan Poneman David Poneman. Put him on the panel, and
Get
then
him
we'll
a
be
mic.
fine.
Dan, you want to comment? Hold on one sec, yeah. Yeah, you're name checked enough that you deserve the comment.
I've been name checked multiple times. By the way, for the record, my brother name is David Poneman.
Oh, thank goodness.
And I'm often
Could you
confused.
bring him next time?
I will bring him. He's much smarter. I am in violent agreement with almost everything that's been said. And I want to have I'll call it a friendly amendment to my dear friend Neil that brings in what Josh said. I think Josh is, and I will have a question, I promise, at the end. I think Josh's 3 steps are critical, but as has been acknowledged, not happening. Secretary of Energy was in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, the birthplace of the Manhattan Project, and he called for Manhattan Project 2. So I say, take it, right? And it does not gainsay what Neil said can happen in the shorter term, and I think all of us would wish to accelerate the timeline. But I think on these things that have been so hard, getting the federal government to provide that level of finance, getting the fuel thing fixed that we wrecked over so many years, I think Manhattan Project is a good metaphor, and it brings people together, and I think it'd be motivating. The question is on one of Josh's specifics, which I think is absolutely right, but it's like many things in government, harder than it looks, regulatory reform. I think there was a lot of joy at the revised mission statement that came out of the NRC, but one swallow does not make a summer, as Shakespeare or someone said. So the question I have to the panel is, what will it take, and is it feasible, given the DNA and what we now have in the NRC, which is a great organization, don't get me wrong, to make the kind of changes to meet the spec that I think Josh properly articulated is critical. And I'll just throw out there, is there any chance of the LNT threshold going away, et cetera, et cetera?
So, I mean, look, I'm an optimist with this. I think that it takes direction and leadership. We've got the direction from Congress to start. There's the change in the mission statement. I think the leaders of the NRC are committed to changing the culture there. And, you know, we've had a situation where they were mostly spending their time regulating existing plants that were operating and unfortunately decommissioning a lot of plants. So they hadn't had much demand or practice evaluating novel technologies, getting it through the system. They are doing that, and what we're seeing right now is that they're actually continuing to surpass what expectations they've set with the applicants, and so they're getting approvals through faster than the deadlines they've set and agreed upon. They need to double and triple down on that, and you need to see that from leadership. They also need to make sure they have sufficient budget and they get the next generation of really talented staff, because it is, like many agencies, particularly involved with nuclear, it hasn't been refreshed in a while, and they're facing a lot more competition from a number of companies to get in talented young nuclear engineers and other people into the space. So they're still facing some challenges.
And just a two-finger on that, to bring it back to climate philanthropy. There are very few think tanks, including Third Way and the Breakthrough Institute and a handful of others, who have been working on things like these changes at the NRC. And climate philanthropy has mostly not engaged at all in what I think could be transformative and could really help unlock an important technology. And I think there are political benefits to having a broader strategy that includes more technologies and more policy pathways to create a more bipartisan and a more durable climate strategy that climate philanthropy really needs to take seriously. So that would be my climate realism for philanthropy pitch.
All right, so one more brief question, and then we're going to have a lightning round where you tell me realistically what gives you hope.
Thanks, David. Nat Cohen from C2S. I will make my question brief. I don't know if the
Also,
answers
another,
can be
you can't
brief.
mention Dan Poneman.
I won't mention Dan. Oh, I'm sorry. So here's the question, and I don't envy you. I mean, we're up on, you know, as Josh said, things are changing kind of by the minute. And so I always think of, you know, I know what I would have said if I were on a panel a week ago, but I don't know what I would say now. So I'm going to ask you all a tough, maybe not a tough, but a big picture question. Suppose we're thinking 3 or 4 years ahead, and this administration has really dismantled a lot of the current, I don't mean this in a partisan way, just factually has dismantled a lot of the regulatory agencies. The DOE, OSED's been pulled back. You can imagine the sort of addition. What does the next, in your view, what should the next administration do? Maybe a chance to rebuild something new. What would it look like starting from scratch to build something that would really drive U.S. innovation and competitiveness in the energy space?
David, take it on.
Okay, great. And I'm not allowed to use Dan Poneman's name in vain either?
Only once. You just did it. You just used your quarter.
We already used our phone a friend. It's a great question, Nat. My best, I'll give you a high-level stylistic answer, but I'd have to think about this more to give a more thoughtful answer, but I'm a deep believer that there's hysteresis in this system. We're not going back. That even if you had a different administration in 4 years' time, it's not that you just go back to the way things were. You don't go out and rehire a bunch of people. I presume that we will be starting from a place in which we've either, by whatever metric is used, achieved or will be close to having achieved AGI. And there will be the cuts and some of the efficiency measures, let's say, that are going on now will have been digested. And so there will be a chance to build back up from a regulatory and kind of government implementation, governance perspective, essentially an AI-first sort of approach to everything from, you know, permitting to regulatory streamlining, et cetera, that, again, should be helpful in debottlenecking that queue of clean firm that's waiting in the interconnection queue and allows us to build faster and more effectively and more efficiently. I also think that there will be, and it'll be interesting to see where the relationship between government and big tech is at the end of this 4-year period. I don't want to predict where it'll be, but I just think that is one of the narratives that will be interesting to watch. And I think that these are systemically important American firms with a complex relationship with the broader civil shared, kind of social public interest, but they're also indispensable and unavoidable, and will have a lot of cash on hand and will have an ascendant role, even more ascendant role, presumably in the global economy as AI continues to diffuse outwards. So that also it seems to me like it's a really interesting question of what role do they play in some of these issues and some of these questions, considering that they're interwoven with the fabric of our energy system more and more now. Those are just two initial pieces of food for thought.
Pretty good job on the cold call. Well done. All right, so we're going to start with Neil. 30 seconds each. What gives you hope realistically?
Look, the markets are working. And we saw in the first Trump term, he pulled us out of Paris. EPA regs were gutted. He had pro-fossil fuel, anti-renewable rhetoric, and yet year over year, carbon emissions declined in the U.S. power sector because Americans are now more aware of the opportunities they have in this space. The business case for clean energy improves every hour, every day. Decarbonization is the greatest monetary opportunity of our lifetime, maybe second to digitization, but in combination with digitization, it's the greatest monetary opportunity of our lifetime. I don't think politics is going to be able to deter this momentum. So I'm actually not worried about it. I think 4 years from now, 8 years from now, if we have a third or fourth Trump term, it's still going to be fine.
Okay, I said realistically. Rachel.
Okay, I'll keep it to 30 seconds. Unpopular autocrats don't have the power that popular autocrats have. So if you crash the global economy, I don't know, that's my silver lining. I'm not very optimistic. I don't know if you can tell. Today's a hard day. I'm usually optimistic, but.
David.
Mine will be a variation on everything that's been said, which is just that my deep belief and conviction is that despite the ennui, despite the angst, despite the polarization, the media environment we live in, the vast majority of Americans may not use the same words or rhetoric for it, and we overly code the words and rhetoric, but we all want the same thing, that there's a vast constituency for affordable, abundant, cheap, clean energy, and there is a narrow constituency that actually opposes it at some far end of the spectrum on either side. And so that if we can kind of expand our vocabulary, expand our minds, open our minds, we're going to be able to actually achieve a lot. And that the United States still has, to this day, the special sauce, the secret ingredients that are kind of needed to be at the forefront of that innovation.
99.9% of Americans have no idea what ennui means, including myself.
It's like if France had a word for entrepreneur, right?
But Neil, this is in the spirit of make resource adequacy unsexy again.
So I think we've already achieved that.
I'll give
last
three
question.
quick things. One is just the United States is the private capital investment engine for innovation, and that will still exist even after what happened late last week and this week. It can drive innovation both domestically and globally, and I think we have the resources to do that. Number two, as a Democrat, we are seeing a real shift and return to have government do less, but do it much better. I think we lost that over the last several decades, and it is becoming a really potent force again. And the third, which I think has, we'll see how long the unfortunate effects are, but as someone who believes that free and fair trade is very important, the American public is unfortunately going through a horrible crash education in the importance of free and fair trade. I think when we get to the other side of it, hopefully we'll have a return to that, and that we will be able to restore solid bonds with the countries that we need to work with.
All right, well, thank you guys so much.
Exactly.
I hope the Climate Realism Initiative gives you hope, and we will reconvene with two more Davids, I believe, in the final panel at 4 o'clock. Thank you again for joining us, and thank the panelists very much.